Some wounds run so deep they change a man's entire life, forcing him to choose between solitude and the chance to heal another broken soul. John Dalton learned this truth the hard way in the remote mountains of Colorado Territory, where he's lived alone for 15 years after the world betrayed him once too often. His small cabin became his sanctuary, surrounded by towering pines and protected by silence. But on one stormy night in 1887, everything changed. A desperate knock came through the rain and thunder, weak, frantic, barely heard above the storm. When John opened his door, he found a young woman collapsed on his doorstep, bloodied and broken, whispering just 3 words that would shatter his carefully built isolation. She was running from something terrible, and now danger was coming to his mountain. What dark forces drove this stranger to his remote doorstep, and will helping her cost John the peace he's fought so hard to protect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The heavy wooden door creaked on its iron hinges as John Dalton stepped back, his weathered hands still gripping the handle. Lightning illuminated the woman's pale face for a brief moment before thunder rolled across the mountain peaks like the echo of distant cannon fire. She couldn't weigh more than 110 pounds, he reckoned, but dead weight was always heavier than it looked. "Help me, please," she whispered again, her voice barely audible above the storm. John's grey eyes swept the darkness beyond his doorstep, searching for signs of pursuit. His instincts, honed by years of military service and sharpened by 15 years of mountain solitude, told him he was making a mistake. But something deeper, a part of himself he'd thought long dead, wouldn't let him leave her in the storm. He lifted her carefully, surprised by his own gentleness. Her torn dress was sodden with rain and blood, her dark hair matted against her skull. As he carried her inside, the familiar scent of his cabin, pine smoke, leather, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil seemed foreign with another person's presence. The cabin reflected 15 years of careful solitude. Everything had its place. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel bare, except for a single kerosene lamp. A rough-hewn table sat near the kitchen area, where cast-iron pots hung from wooden pegs. His narrow bed occupied the far corner, covered with wool blankets and a bearskin he'd taken during his second winter here. No photographs adorned the walls, no letters lay scattered on surfaces. John had deliberately stripped his surroundings of anything that might remind him of the world he'd left behind. He laid the woman on his bed and lit 2 more lamps, their warm glow revealing the extent of her injuries. Blood had soaked through her blue cotton dress at the shoulder, and purple bruises marked her throat like fingerprints. Her left wrist was swollen, possibly broken, but it was her face that troubled him most, the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much, too quickly. As John gathered water and clean cloth, memories stirred unbidden. The summer of 1872, when he'd served as field medic for the 7th Cavalry Regiment under Colonel George Custer. Before the Little Bighorn, before the betrayal that had driven him to these mountains. His hands remembered the motions, cleaning wounds, assessing damage, determining what could be saved and what was lost forever. The woman's shoulder wound wasn't from a bullet. The tear was too jagged, more likely from a tree branch or sharp rock. But the bruising on her throat was deliberate, purposeful. Someone had tried to strangle her. John's jaw tightened as he began cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency. She stirred as he worked, mumbling fragments that made no sense. "Tell father the books don't match," she whispered. "The Denver route. They changed the Denver route." Her fingers clutched at something against her chest, a small silver locket that had somehow survived whatever violence had brought her. Here, John had always been good at reading people. It had kept him alive during the Apache campaigns, helped him identify which of his fellow soldiers could be trusted in a fight. This woman wasn't a settler's wife or a traveling missionary. Her hands were too soft, her remaining clothing too fine. The locket was real silver, not plated tin. Whatever story brought her to his door, it started with money and privilege. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain. Rain drove against the cabin's windows with the persistence of bullets, and wind howled through the pine forest like the voices of the dead. John had weathered hundreds of such storms in this place, finding comfort in their predictable fury. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the storm seemed to be delivering something he wasn't sure he wanted. He'd built this cabin with his own hands during that first terrible winter, when grief and rage had driven him to work from dawn until exhaustion claimed him. Every log had been cut and fitted with deliberate precision, every chink sealed against the mountain's attempts to reclaim the space. The cabin wasn't just shelter, it was proof that John Dalton could survive alone, that he needed nothing and no one from the world that had cast him out. The woman's breathing had steadied, though she remained unconscious. John found himself studying her face in the lamplight. She was young, probably no more than 25, with strong features that spoke of determination rather than delicate beauty. Her dark hair, once properly arranged, now framed her face in damp tangles. There was something familiar about her, though John couldn't place what it might be. He reached for the wooden box he kept beneath his bed, hesitating before opening it. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a tarnished cavalry medal, the only physical reminder of Captain John Dalton, decorated veteran of the Indian Wars. The medal represented everything he'd once been: honorable, trusted, respected by his men and superiors alike. Before Lieutenant Morrison had sold intelligence to Apache war parties. Before half his regiment had died because someone decided 30 pieces of silver was worth more than soldiers' lives. Before the military tribunal had accepted Morrison's lies and branded John a coward who'd abandoned his post. The medal felt heavy in his palm, its bronze surface worn smooth by years of handling. He'd kept it not from pride, but as a reminder of how quickly honor could be stripped away, how completely trust could be shattered. Yet now, looking at this broken woman in his bed, he found himself remembering not the betrayal, but the oath he'd once taken, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. John replaced the medal and closed the box. Whatever had happened to this woman, whoever was pursuing her, it wasn't his concern. He'd learned the price of involvement, the cost of caring about anything beyond his own survival. Come morning, he'd give her food and directions to the nearest town. That was charity enough for any man. But as he settled into his chair to keep watch through the night, John couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. The woman's presence had already changed something fundamental in the cabin's atmosphere. After 15 years of perfect silence, he could hear his own breathing, notice the way shadows fell differently with another person sharing the space. The storm began to weaken near dawn, thunder growing distant and rain softening to a steady patter. John dozed fitfully in his chair, one hand resting on the Colt revolver in his lap. He'd learned long ago that sleep was a luxury that could cost a man his life. But exhaustion was claiming him despite his vigilance. When the woman finally stirred, speaking clearly for the first time, her words chilled him more than any mountain winter. "They killed my father," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears flowing down her cheeks. "And they're coming for me." John set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, the ceramic clicking against the wooden table. The woman, she'd said her name was Anna, sat propped against his pillows, her dark eyes alert despite the pain etched across her features. 2 days had passed since the storm, and her color had improved, but the fear never left her face. "Anna's not your real name," John said quietly, refilling his cup from the iron pot. "I've been listening to you talk in your sleep. You mentioned someone called Elizabeth, and you keep apologizing to your father." Her fingers tightened around the silver locket at her throat. John had noticed how she clutched it whenever she thought he wasn't looking, the way a drowning person might grip a rope. The locket itself was fine work, real silver with delicate engravings along its edges. "Too expensive for a simple traveling woman? I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. John pulled his chair closer to the bed, his grey eyes studying her face. "I was a soldier for 23 years. I learned to spot lies before they could get me killed. You're running from something, and it's not common bandits. Anna, or Elizabeth, stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of terrible memory. There was a wagon train. We were traveling from Denver to Colorado Springs when men attacked us at Devil's Canyon. They killed everyone, the drivers, the other passengers, the guards, but not you. I hid under one of the wagons, played dead when they checked the bodies. Her hand moved unconsciously to the bruises on her throat. One of them found me anyway, started dragging me away from the others. I managed to break free, ran into the forest. John listened without comment, but his military instincts catalogued the inconsistencies. Her dress was torn, but not filthy enough for days in the wilderness. The cut on her shoulder was too clean for a desperate flight through mountain timber. And her hands, despite the swelling around her wrist, showed no signs of clawing through brush or climbing rocks. "Show me the locket," he said. "What?" "The locket you keep touching. If you're just a passenger on a wagon train, why are you protecting that piece of jewelry with your life?" For a moment, defiance flashed in her eyes. Then her shoulders sagged and she fumbled with the clasp. The locket opened to reveal a small photograph. A distinguished man in an expensive suit standing beside a younger version of the woman in John's bed. Both were posed in front of an ornate building with Denver and Pacific Railroad carved into its stone facade. "My father," she whispered. Charles Harmon, John knew the name. Even in his mountain isolation, news of the railroad baron's recent death had reached him through traveling prospectors. Charles Harmon had been found dead in his Denver office 3 weeks ago, apparently from a heart attack brought on by business pressures. The newspapers said he died of natural causes. The newspapers lied. Elizabeth's voice hardened. "He was murdered." "I saw it happen." She told him the truth then, words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. How she'd arrived at her father's office unannounced that evening, hoping to surprise him with news of her engagement. How she'd heard voices through the door, her father arguing with his business partner, a man named Vincent Kellerman. How the argument had escalated until Kellerman struck her father with a heavy brass paperweight. "I should have screamed," Elizabeth said, tears flowing freely now. "Should have run for help, but I was frozen, couldn't move." Kellerman saw me through the doorway, started walking toward me with this terrible smile. I finally ran, made it to the stairs before he caught me. The bruises on her throat made sense now. So did the desperate flight, the torn dress, the bone-deep terror in her eyes. Kellerman's been searching for me ever since. He has men everywhere. In the sheriff's office, the marshal service, even some of the churches. I couldn't trust anyone in Denver, so I hired private guards to get me to Colorado Springs. Thought maybe the territorial authorities there would listen, but Kellerman found you anyway. 3 men dressed as lawmen stopped our wagon. Said they were U.S. Marshals with a warrant for my arrest on charges of theft. My guards believed them, started to hand me over. That's when I realized the badges were fake. Real marshals would have shown papers, followed proper procedure. I broke away during the confusion, ran into the forest. John stood and walked to the window, his mind working through the implications. If Elizabeth was telling the truth, then Kellerman had resources that extended far beyond Denver. The kind of money and influence that could buy false badges and corrupt officials. The kind of power that would never stop hunting until she was silenced permanently. "Why should I believe you?" he asked without turning around. "Because you're the first person in 3 weeks who hasn't tried to kill me or turn me over to someone who would." Through the window, John spotted movement in the distant tree line. 3 riders picked their way carefully along the ridge trail, their horses' breath visible in the cold morning air. Too far to make out details, but close enough to be trouble. "We've got company," he said, reaching for the brass spyglass on his mantle. Elizabeth went rigid. "How many?" John adjusted the spyglass focus, studying the approaching riders. They wore the unmistakable clothing of lawmen, dark coats, flat-brimmed hats, badges glinting on their chests. But something felt wrong about their formation, the way they moved with too much certainty toward his cabin. 3 men. They're dressed like marshals, but they're riding like hunters who know exactly where their prey is hiding. Elizabeth's face went white. "It's them." Kellerman's men. They found me. John lowered the spyglass, his mind racing through options. The cabin sat in a natural clearing with excellent sightlines in all directions, good for defense, terrible for escape. The root cellar beneath his kitchen floor could hide one person, but not for long. And if these men were willing to kill a railroad baron, they wouldn't hesitate to burn down a hermit's cabin with both occupants inside. "There's a hiding place under the kitchen floor," he said, already moving toward his gun rack. "Hidden panel behind the flour barrel. You can fit inside, but you'll need to stay quiet no matter what happens up here. What about you?" John pulled down his Sharps rifle, the weapon that had served him faithfully through 3 Apache campaigns. Its worn stock felt familiar in his hands, like greeting an old friend after a long separation. "I'm going to find out exactly who these men are and what they want," he said, beginning to load the rifle with practiced efficiency. "If they're legitimate law enforcement, we'll sort this out properly. If they're not—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Elizabeth understood. She slipped from the bed, moving carefully on her injured leg, and followed him toward the kitchen. John pulled aside the flour barrel, revealing a rectangular panel in the floorboards. Beneath lay a narrow space just large enough for a person to lie flat. "No matter what you hear," John said, as she lowered herself into the hiding place, "don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Elizabeth looked up at him from the cramped space, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know if I'm telling the truth." John replaced the panel and moved the flour barrel back into position. Through the window, he could see the riders were less than a quarter-mile away now, their horses moving at a steady pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. "Because," he said, checking the load in his Colt revolver, 15 years ago, someone I trusted sold me out to save his own skin. If there's a chance you're telling the truth about your father, then I know exactly how that feels." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the surrounding pines like a countdown to whatever came next. John positioned himself beside the window, the Sharps rifle cradled across his forearm. The 3 riders had reached the edge of his clearing, their horses stepping carefully through the morning mist that clung to the mountain grass. From this distance, he could make out more details through his spyglass. Expensive horses with quality tack, men who sat their saddles with the confidence of professional riders. But their leader bothered him most. The man in front was tall and lean, probably in his 40s, with the kind of pale complexion that spoke of city living rather than frontier work. His badge caught the morning sunlight, but something about its placement seemed wrong. Real lawmen wore their badges with casual familiarity, not positioned for maximum visibility. "Hello, the cabin," the leader called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "Deputy Marshal Clayton Reeves, United States Marshal Service. We'd like a word with you." John stayed silent, watching through the window as the 3 men spread out in a loose formation. Not the behavior of lawmen making a routine inquiry. More like soldiers preparing for potential resistance. "We're looking for a fugitive woman," Reeves continued, his horse stepping sideways as he scanned the cabin's exterior. "Goes by the name Elizabeth Harmon. She's wanted in connection with theft of railroad property and murder of a peace officer. The charges were lies, John knew, but convincingly delivered." Reeves had the smooth voice of a confidence man, someone accustomed to making people believe whatever story served his purposes. The other 2 men remained silent, their hands resting casually near their sidearms. John opened his door and stepped onto the porch, the Sharps held low but ready. "Morning, Marshal. John Dalton. This is my property." Reeves smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Mr. Dalton, we appreciate your cooperation. Have you seen any strangers in the area? A woman traveling alone, possibly injured?" "No strangers," John replied, his gray eyes studying each man in turn. "Been quiet up here since the snow melted." The marshal on Reeves's left, a heavy-set man with a thick beard, shifted in his saddle. "Mind if we search your cabin?" "Standard procedure when tracking a dangerous fugitive." John's grip tightened on the rifle. Real marshals would have shown a warrant before requesting a search. They would have introduced themselves properly, explained the specific charges. followed the protocols that separated legitimate law enforcement from men with badges and guns. "I'd need to see some identification first," John said, "and paperwork authorizing the search." Reeves' smile faltered slightly. "Of course. Always good to meet a law-abiding citizen." He reached inside his coat, but instead of producing documents, his hand moved toward the revolver at his hip. John raised the sharps in one smooth motion, the barrel centered on Reeves' chest. "I wouldn't." The clearing went silent except for the soft snorting of horses and the whisper of wind through pine needles. The three men froze, their hands now openly reaching for weapons, but not yet drawing them. John's military training kicked in. Assess the threats, identify cover positions, calculate angles of fire. "Easy now," Reeves said, his voice losing its friendly tone. "No need for anyone to get hurt here. We're just doing our job." "Your job doesn't include threatening citizens or conducting illegal searches," John replied. "Real marshals carry proper documentation. They follow procedure. They don't ride in formation like cavalry preparing for a charge." The bearded man's hand crept closer to his gun. "Maybe this mountain man's been alone too long, Clayton. Starting to see conspiracies where there ain't none." John shifted his aim slightly, the rifle now pointing at the bearded man. "Maybe you should tell me why your badges looked like they were stamped yesterday, or why your horses are shod with Denver blacksmith work when the nearest marshal's office is in Colorado Springs." Reeves cursed under his breath. The pretense was crumbling, and all four men knew it. John had spent too many years reading enemies across Apache war parties to miss the subtle signals passing between the three riders. They were preparing to move, and when they did, it would be with lethal intent. "Last chance," John said quietly. "Ride out now, and we'll call this a misunderstanding." Instead of retreating, Reeves spurred his horse forward while simultaneously drawing his revolver. The movement was quick and practiced, but John had been expecting it. The sharps boomed across the clearing, its heavy bullet taking Reeves in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. The other two men reacted instantly, their own weapons clearing leather as their horses reared and plunged. John dropped behind the porch railing, already reaching for his Colt as rifle bullets splintered the wood around his head. The familiar rhythm of combat settled over him. Move, shoot, move again. Stay alive long enough to win. He put 2 rounds into the bearded man's horse, sending both animal and rider crashing to the ground. The third man, younger and faster than his companions, managed to dismount and reach the cover of John's woodpile before return fire could find him. "Give us the woman, Dalton," Reeves shouted from where he lay, clutching his wounded shoulder. "Hand her over and we'll ride out peaceful-like." John reloaded the sharps, his hands moving with automatic precision despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Don't know what woman you're talking about." "The hell you don't. We tracked her here from Devil's Canyon. Blood trail leads right to your door." From behind the woodpile, the young gunman fired 3 quick shots that shattered John's front window. Glass cascaded onto the porch as John rolled to a new position, using the corner of the cabin for cover. The bearded man had freed himself from his dead horse and was crawling toward better cover, leaving a trail of blood from a gashed leg. Reeves was trying to reload his revolver one-handed, cursing steadily as he fumbled with cartridges. The tactical situation was manageable, but John knew this was just the beginning. If these 3 had found him, others would follow. "You're making a mistake, old man," the young gunman called out. "Mr. Kellerman's got a long reach and a longer memory. Even if you kill us, he'll send more." So Elizabeth had been telling the truth about Kellerman. John filed that information away as he lined up a shot on the bearded man's position. The sharps spoke again, its bullet punching through the fallen tree the man was using for shelter. The return fire came from 2 directions now, forcing John to keep moving along the cabin's exterior. He was outnumbered, but held the advantage of knowing every inch of this terrain. More importantly, he was fighting for something that mattered again, not just survival, but the protection of someone who couldn't protect herself. As bullets continued to fly across his peaceful clearing, John Dalton felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. He felt useful. The gunfight lasted another 10 minutes before the 3 men finally retreated. dragging their wounded and leaving behind one dead horse and considerable blood. John watched through his spyglass as they disappeared into the tree line, Reeves swaying in his saddle from blood loss. They'd be back, but not today. Not with their leader needing medical attention and their confidence thoroughly shaken. John waited another hour before moving the flour barrel and lifting the hidden panel. Elizabeth emerged from the cramped space, pale and trembling, her dark eyes wide with questions she was afraid to ask. "They're gone," John said, helping her stand. "For now." "I heard shooting." "Are you hurt?" John shook his head, then moved to his gun cabinet and began pulling out ammunition boxes. "We need to talk. Really talk this time. No more half-truths or convenient omissions." Elizabeth sank into his wooden chair, her fingers automatically reaching for the locket at her throat. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Starting with this." John produced a gold pocket watch from his vest, its surface gleaming, despite several dents and scratches. "I found this in your dress pocket while I was cleaning your wounds. The inscription reads, 'To Charles, with love and pride, C.H., your mother.'" Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "Catherine Harmon. She died when I was 12. Father carried that watch every day since their wedding." John opened the watch, revealing not just a timepiece, but a small compartment behind the main mechanism. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, covered with numbers and symbols that meant nothing to him, but clearly held significance for Elizabeth. "The real reason Kellerman killed your father," John said. "It's in here, isn't it?" Elizabeth took the watch with reverent care, her fingers tracing the worn gold surface. "Father discovered that Kellerman was selling railroad route information to outlaw gangs. Not just our routes, every major line between Denver and San Francisco. The robberies weren't random attacks. They were coordinated strikes against specific shipments." "What kind of shipments?" "Gold from the Colorado mines, silver from Nevada, but mostly government payroll shipments to army posts throughout the territory." Elizabeth's voice grew stronger as she spoke, anger replacing fear. "Kellerman had access to all the shipping schedules, all the route changes, even the security arrangements. He was feeding everything to a network of bandits, then splitting the profits." John understood now why 3 fake marshals had tracked Elizabeth across 100 miles of wilderness. If she could prove government payroll money was being stolen through inside information, it would trigger federal investigations that could topple corrupt officials throughout the territory. The watch contains the evidence, shipping schedules in Father's handwriting, matched against newspaper reports of robberies. Dates, amounts, even the names of some of Kellerman's contacts in the territorial government. Elizabeth opened the hidden compartment, revealing several thin sheets of paper covered with her father's precise script. "Enough to hang a dozen men." John studied the papers, his military experience helping him recognize the implications. Payroll robberies weren't just theft, they were attacks on the U.S. Army's ability to maintain order in the territories. Men like Kellerman weren't simple criminals. They were actively undermining federal authority for personal profit. "Why didn't your father take this to the authorities when he discovered it?" "He tried. Went to the territorial marshal's office in Denver. But the chief deputy there is a man named Morrison, one of the names on Father's list. When Morrison realized what Father had discovered, he warned Kellerman instead of investigating." Morrison. John felt ice form in his stomach. Lieutenant James Morrison, the man who had sold out John's cavalry unit 15 years ago, had apparently continued his career of betrayal in civilian law enforcement. "James Morrison," John said quietly. "Tall man, brown hair, scar on his left hand from a knife fight." Elizabeth stared at him. "You know him?" "We have a history." John's voice carried 15 years of barely contained rage. "Morrison was the officer who sold intelligence to Apache war parties in 1872. Half my regiment died because he needed money to pay gambling debts. The implications hit both of them simultaneously. Morrison's betrayal of John's unit hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that had continued for decades. The same man who had sold soldiers' lives to hostile Indians was now selling railroad information to outlaw gangs. "This is bigger than just your father's murder," John said, beginning to pace the small cabin. Morrison, Kellerman, probably dozens of others. They've been systematically looting territorial commerce for years. Elizabeth rose from the chair, her injured legs still weak but her resolve clearly strengthening. Then we have to stop them. We have to get this evidence to someone who can't be bought. Who? Morrison controls the marshal service in this region. Kellerman owns half the territorial legislature. Even if we reach someone honest, how do we prove the evidence is genuine? Elizabeth smiled for the first time since arriving at his cabin. Because father was smarter than Kellerman gave him credit for. The watch doesn't just contain shipping schedules and robbery reports. It contains bank deposit records showing exactly where Kellerman's share of the stolen money went. She pulled out another sheet of paper, this one covered with bank stamps and official seals. Denver First National, Colorado Springs Merchant Bank, even accounts in San Francisco and Chicago. Father traced every dollar, every transaction. This isn't just evidence of the robberies. It's a complete financial map of their entire operation. John examined the bank records, his respect for Charles Harmon growing with each detail. The dead railroad baron had built an airtight case against his murderers, documenting their crimes with the thoroughness of a military intelligence officer. Your father was a careful man. He was a good man. He believed in doing what was right, even when it cost him everything. Elizabeth's voice broke slightly. I won't let his death be meaningless. John closed the watch and handed it back to her. Then we need to get you and this evidence somewhere safe. Reeves and his men will be back, probably with reinforcements. This cabin won't be defensible against a larger force. Where can we go? If Morrison controls law enforcement and Kellerman owns the politicians, who can we trust? John moved to his gun rack and began selecting weapons. There's a man in Denver, Colonel William Hayes, retired Army. He was my commanding officer before Morrison, and he's completely honest. Problem is, Denver's exactly where Kellerman expects you to run, so we don't run to Denver. We make Denver come to us. John looked at her with new respect. What do you mean? Elizabeth clutched her father's watch, her dark eyes bright with determination. We send word to your colonel friend. Tell him we have evidence of treason against federal interests. Men like Hayes don't ignore calls for help from fellow soldiers. Outside, thunder rumbled across the mountain peaks, another storm approaching. But this time John found himself almost welcoming the sound. John spread the topographical map across his kitchen table, its worn edges held down by coffee cups and ammunition boxes. The map showed every ridge, valley, and game trail within 50 miles of his cabin, knowledge accumulated through 15 years of solitary hunting and 3 decades of military reconnaissance training. Red ink marked potential defensive positions, blue showed water sources, and thin pencil lines traced escape routes he'd planned but never hoped to use. They'll come back with more men, he said, pointing to the various approaches to his cabin. Probably try to surround us, cut off escape routes. Reeves strikes me as the type who learns from his mistakes. Elizabeth leaned over the map, her finger tracing the mountain trails. Despite her injuries, she'd proven surprisingly resilient, asking intelligent questions about terrain and tactics. How many men can Kellerman field? More than we can handle in a straight fight. John's pencil marked additional positions on the map. But numbers don't always determine the outcome. During the Apache campaigns, I saw small units defeat much larger forces by using terrain and superior knowledge of the ground. The parallel between his current situation and those long-ago battles wasn't lost on John. Once again, he was outnumbered and surrounded by enemies who wanted him dead. But this time felt different. This time he was fighting for something beyond mere survival. Elizabeth studied the map with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. What about this trail here? It looks like it connects to the main road near Copper Creek. Good eye. That's one of our best options if we need to run. But it's also the most obvious route, which means they'll probably have it watched. John drew a circle around the trail junction. The key is having multiple options. Force them to spread their resources thin. As they planned, John found himself sharing tactical knowledge he'd kept buried for 15 years. The principles of defensive warfare, the importance of fallback positions, the psychology of men under pressure. Elizabeth absorbed it all with remarkable quickness, asking questions that showed she understood not just the mechanics, but the reasoning behind each decision. "You're thinking like a soldier," John observed. "Father served briefly in the Civil War before he went into railroads. He used to say that business and warfare shared many of the same principles. Know your enemy, control the terrain, never let them dictate the terms of engagement." Elizabeth's smile carried both pride and sadness. "I suppose I learned more than I realized." John marked another position on the map, then paused. The memories were coming back despite his efforts to suppress them, not just of Morrison's betrayal, but of the events that led up to it. The summer of 1872, when Apache raids had escalated along the Arizona border. Colonel Hayes had assembled a strike force to hunt down the war parties, and Lieutenant Morrison had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment. "What is it?" Elizabeth asked, noticing his hesitation. "Morrison," John said slowly. "I keep thinking about why he did it. Betrayed his own men for money. Some people will do anything if the price is right. Maybe, but Morrison wasn't desperate. He came from a wealthy family back east, never lacked for anything. The gambling debts were real, but his father would have covered them." John set down his pencil, staring at the map without seeing it. "I think he enjoyed it. The power of deciding who lived and who died." Elizabeth reached across the table and touched his hand. "Is that why you came here? To get away from people like him?" John looked at her fingers resting on his weathered skin. It had been 15 years since anyone had touched him with simple human kindness. "Partly. After the tribunal cleared Morrison and branded me a coward, I realized the world I'd served didn't want soldiers like me. It wanted soldiers like him. Men willing to sacrifice others for personal gain, but you're willing to sacrifice yourself for me. What's the difference?" The question hit deeper than Elizabeth probably intended. John had been asking himself the same thing since Reeves and his men rode away. Why was he risking everything for a woman he'd known for 3 days? Why did her cause matter more than his carefully preserved solitude? "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because this time I get to choose who I'm fighting for." They returned to studying the map, but the conversation had shifted something between them. Elizabeth's presence in his cabin no longer felt like an intrusion, but like a partnership. Her questions weren't challenges to his authority, but contributions to their mutual survival. "Tell me about this area," Elizabeth said, pointing to a cluster of ridges north of the cabin. "Could we set up observation posts there?" "Already have one. There's a cave about 2 miles up that ridge, well concealed, but with excellent sight lines back toward the cabin. I use it during hunting season to spot deer movements. Could someone survive there for several days?" John studied her face, recognizing the direction of her thoughts. "You're thinking about splitting up. Having one of us act as lookout while the other stays mobile. It makes tactical sense, doesn't it? If they surround the cabin, we're trapped. But if one of us is positioned to observe their movements, no." John's voice carried absolute finality. "I'm not leaving you alone, and I'm not letting you take that kind of risk." "Why not?" "You said yourself that I'm learning to think like a soldier, because soldiers don't abandon their wounded." John began folding the map, his jaw set in the stubborn line Elizabeth was learning to recognize. "Because I've spent 15 years running away from responsibility, and I'm not starting again now." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. "This isn't about tactics, is it? This is about Morrison." John's hands stilled on the map. She was right, and they both knew it. Morrison had abandoned his men when they needed him most, choosing personal gain over loyalty and honor. The parallel was uncomfortably exact. "I won't be Morrison," John said quietly. "Not for you, not for anyone." Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the clearing, multiple riders moving at a steady pace. John grabbed his spyglass and moved to the window, counting at least 6 men, arranged in a wide semicircle around his property. "They're back," he said, reaching for his rifle. "And they brought friends." Elizabeth clutched her father's watch, her face pale but determined. "Then we fight." John checked the load in his shops, the familiar weight of the weapon steadying his nerves. "Yes, we fight. The siege began at dawn. 6 riders had surrounded John's cabin during the night, positioning themselves at carefully calculated distances that kept them beyond accurate rifle range, while maintaining clear fields of fire toward all exits. Professional work that spoke of military training and patient planning. John crouched beside the shattered front window, studying their positions through his spyglass. Reeves had learned from yesterday's encounter, keeping his men spread wide and using natural cover. The wounded marshal himself remained mounted on a small rise 200 yards out, well protected by a cluster of granite boulders. "They're not coming closer," Elizabeth observed from her position near the back door. She held John's spare Colt revolver with competent familiarity, though he hoped she wouldn't need to use it. "They don't need to. They can wait us out." John lowered the spyglass, calculating their dwindling options. "We've got water from the well and enough food for maybe a week. But they know we can't stay here indefinitely. What do they want? To make us desperate enough to try running, force us into the open where they can finish this cleanly." John moved to the kitchen window, checking the positions of the 2 men watching the cabin's north side. "Reeves is smart. He knows a prolonged gunfight might attract attention from legitimate authorities." Elizabeth fingered her mother's wedding ring, a simple gold band she'd worn since her father's death. The ring had belonged to Catherine Harmon for 30 years before passing to her daughter, and Elizabeth drew comfort from its familiar weight. It represented continuity, family legacy, the kind of enduring love that made fighting worthwhile. "Tell me about the Apache campaigns," she said, settling beside John at the window. "How did small units survive when they were outnumbered?" John smiled despite their circumstances. Elizabeth's appetite for tactical knowledge impressed him. She understood that learning was their best weapon against superior numbers. "Mobility," he said. "Never stay in one place long enough for the enemy to pin you down. Use terrain to break up their formations. Force them to fight on your terms, not theirs. But we're pinned down here, are we?" John pulled out his map again, pointing to the various trails marked around his property. "They think we're trapped because they can see the cabin. But they can't watch every game trail, every ravine, every deer path through these mountains." Elizabeth studied the map with growing understanding. "You're talking about leaving the cabin?" "I'm talking about making them think we've left the cabin while actually moving to a position where we can observe their next move." John traced a route, with his finger, down through the root cellar, along a dry creek bed that ran behind his property, up through a series of ridges that would put them above and behind the besiegers. "My observation post overlooks their current positions. If we can reach it undetected, we turn the hunters into the hunted." "Exactly." John began gathering supplies, ammunition, dried food, his field glasses, a spare rifle. "But it means abandoning everything I've built here. Once we leave, I can never come back. They'll burn it down or watch it permanently." Elizabeth looked around the cabin that had been John's sanctuary for 15 years. Every piece of furniture had been crafted by his hands, every room arranged exactly to his preferences. The thought of losing it clearly pained him, but she could see his resolve hardening. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to save what matters most," she said softly. John paused in his preparations, struck by the simple wisdom of her words. Elizabeth had already lost everything. Her father, her home, her comfortable life in Denver. Yet here she was, ready to risk even more to see justice done. "Your father raised a remarkable woman. He raised me to fight for what's right, even when the odds are against me." Elizabeth checked the cylinder of her revolver, her movements growing more confident. "Especially when the odds are against me." They spent the next hour preparing for their escape, using hand signals to communicate whenever they moved near windows. John showed Elizabeth how to move silently, how to use available cover, how to read the terrain for potential threats and opportunities. She proved a quick student, adapting to each lesson with natural grace. The plan required precise timing. John's root cellar connected to a natural cave system that emerged near the creek bed, a feature he'd discovered during his first winter, but never expected to use for tactical purposes. They would slip out during the afternoon heat when their watchers might be drowsy, follow the creek upstream for 2 miles, then climb to the observation post under cover of approaching darkness. Once we're in position above them, John explained, we'll have every advantage. Better cover, longer sightlines, and the psychological edge of controlling the high ground. What about water and supplies? I've got caches hidden throughout these mountains. We can survive indefinitely if necessary. John sealed their gear in waterproof packs, his movements efficient despite the weight of abandoning his home. The question is whether we want to survive or win. Elizabeth's dark eyes flashed. We want to win. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, they made their final preparations. John took one last look around the cabin, his gaze lingering on the stone fireplace he'd built with his own hands, the shelves that held his few books, the corner where he'd spent countless evenings in solitary contemplation. Regrets? Elizabeth asked, recognizing his expression. No, John said, surprising himself with the honesty of his answer. 15 years ago, I thought I wanted to be left alone forever. Turns out I was wrong. Elizabeth slipped her mother's ring from her finger and held it up to catch the afternoon light. Mother used to say that love isn't about avoiding risk, it's about finding someone worth taking risks for. She offered the ring to John, her meaning clear. It wasn't a proposal or a promise of marriage, but something deeper, a symbol of trust, partnership, and the growing connection between two people who had found each other in the wilderness. John accepted the ring with reverent care, understanding its significance. As he slipped it into his vest pocket, he felt the last of his isolation fall away like a shed skin. Ready? He asked. Elizabeth nodded, checking her revolver one final time. Ready? Together they descended into the root cellar, leaving behind the sanctuary that had protected John for 15 years, and venturing into an uncertain future that they would face as partners. The abandoned mine shaft lay hidden beneath an overhang of granite and pine, its entrance barely visible even to someone who knew where to look. John and Elizabeth had reached it after 2 hours of careful movement through the creek bed and up rocky slopes that left no tracks for their pursuers to follow. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, creating a patchwork of light and shadow that provided excellent concealment. John was checking his rifle when they heard the sound, a low moan echoing from deep within the mine shaft. "Someone's in there," Elizabeth whispered, her hand moving instinctively to her revolver. John nodded, motioning for silence as he approached the mine entrance. The sound came again, definitely human, filled with pain and desperation. Against his better judgment, John found himself moving toward the voice. Elizabeth close behind him, 20 feet into the shaft. They found him. The man lay propped against the tunnel wall, his clothes torn and bloodied, a genuine deputy marshal's badge pinned to his vest. Unlike the polished badges worn by Reeves and his men, this one showed the wear and tarnish of years of honest service. The deputy himself was middle-aged, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades enforcing law on the frontier. "Water," he whispered when he saw them, his voice barely audible. John knelt beside the wounded man, while Elizabeth kept watch at the tunnel entrance. The deputy had been shot twice, once in the shoulder, once in the leg, and had lost considerable blood. But more concerning were the rope burns around his wrists and the evidence that someone had beaten him severely before leaving him to die. "Easy, deputy," John said, offering water from his canteen. "What's your name?" "Tom Bradley, U.S. Marshal Service out of Colorado Springs." Bradley drank greedily, some color returning to his pale features. "Been tracking a gang of fake marshals operating in this territory. Got too close, and they jumped me 3 days ago." Elizabeth moved closer, studying Bradley's face. "Fake marshals?" "Led by a man named Clayton Reeves." Bradley's eyes sharpened despite his pain. "You know about Reeves? Then you know you're in serious trouble. That man's killed more people than cholera." John and Elizabeth exchanged glances. If Bradley was legitimate law enforcement, it changed everything about their situation. "What do you know about Vincent Kellerman?" John asked. "Kellerman?" Bradley struggled to sit up straighter. "Railroad man from Denver. Word is, he's been buying off territorial officials, but we've never been able to prove it." "Why?" Elizabeth pulled out her father's watch, opening it to reveal the hidden evidence. Because my father discovered proof that Kellerman's been orchestrating railroad robberies throughout the territory. And when father tried to expose him, Kellerman had him murdered. Bradley stared at the papers with growing amazement. Jesus Christ! Is this genuine? Bank records, shipping schedules, robbery reports, everything my father could document before Kellerman killed him. Elizabeth's voice grew stronger as she spoke. Enough evidence to bring down corrupt officials from here to Washington, including Deputy Chief Morrison in Denver. John added quietly. Bradley's expression darkened. Morrison! I always suspected that bastard was crooked, but he's been too careful. Never left evidence. He gestured toward the papers. This could change everything. John helped Bradley drink more water, while Elizabeth continued to watch for signs of pursuit. The deputy's presence complicated their tactical situation, but offered something they'd lacked until now: legitimate legal authority. How many men does Reeves have? John asked. 6, maybe 8. All experienced killers. Kellerman pays them well enough to ensure loyalty. Bradley winced as he shifted position. But there's something else you need to know. Something that makes this whole situation more dangerous than you realize. What? Reeves isn't just working for Kellerman. He's working for Morrison, too. Those fake marshal badges they carry? Morrison provided them. This conspiracy goes all the way to the top of territorial law enforcement. The implications hit John like a physical blow. Morrison hadn't just continued his pattern of betrayal, he'd systematized it, creating a network of corruption that extended throughout the territory. The same man who'd sold out John's cavalry unit was now selling out the entire marshal service. There's more, Bradley continued, his voice growing urgent. Morrison's planning something big. A government payroll shipment worth over $200,000 is scheduled to pass through Denver next week. If Kellerman's gang gets their hands on that money, it would fund their operations for years, Elizabeth finished. Give them enough resources to buy every crooked official west of the Mississippi. John stood and began pacing the narrow tunnel, his mind working through the strategic implications. They weren't just fighting for Elizabeth's survival anymore. They were fighting to prevent a massive theft that could destabilize territorial governance for decades. We need to get word to honest federal authorities, he said finally. People Morrison can't reach or intimidate. Bradley managed a weak smile. Funny you should mention that. Before Reeves caught me, I'd arranged to meet with Colonel William Hayes in Denver. Hayes is heading a federal investigation into territorial corruption. He's completely clean, served with distinction during the war, never taken a dishonest dollar in his life. John felt the world shift around him. Colonel Hayes. William Hayes. You know him? He was my commanding officer during the Apache campaigns. Before Morrison. John's voice carried a mixture of hope and trepidation. Hayes never believed the charges against me. He fought the tribunal's decision, but couldn't overturn it without new evidence. Elizabeth reached into her pack and pulled out a tarnished brass object, a counterfeit deputy marshal badge she'd taken from one of Reeves' men during yesterday's gunfight. John had forgotten she'd grabbed it, but now its significance became clear. Evidence, she said, holding up the fake badge. Proof that Morrison's been issuing fraudulent credentials to criminals. Bradley examined the badge with professional interest. This is exactly what Hayes needs. Serial numbers that don't match federal records, metallurgy that's wrong for genuine badges, craftsmanship that screams forgery. He looked up at John with newfound respect. If you can get this to Hayes, along with your lady's evidence about Kellerman, it'll blow this whole conspiracy wide open. John took the fake badge, feeling its weight, lighter than genuine federal issues, with edges that were too sharp and lettering that was slightly off-center. In his hands, it represented more than evidence of corruption. It represented the possibility of redemption, not just for himself, but for every honest lawman who'd been undermined by Morrison's network. How do we reach Hayes? John asked. Morrison controls the telegraph lines and probably has people watching the major roads. Hayes is staying at the International Hotel in Denver under an assumed name, William Patterson. He's scheduled to meet with territorial officials next Tuesday. But if you can reach him before then, Bradley's voice trailed off as footsteps echoed from the mine entrance. Elizabeth grabbed her revolver while John positioned himself to cover the tunnel mouth. But instead of Reeves' men, they heard a familiar voice calling out, "Bradley!" "Tom Bradley? You in there?" "That's Hayes," Bradley whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Colonel Hayes found me." As footsteps approached through the tunnel, John realized their situation had just become infinitely more complex and potentially more hopeful. After 15 years of exile, he was about to face the one man who'd never stopped believing in his innocence. Colonel William Hayes emerged from the tunnel shadows like a figure from John's past stepping into the present. 15 years had added grey to his temples and lines around his eyes, but his bearing remained unmistakably military, straight-backed, alert, commanding. He wore civilian clothes, but the Colt at his hip and the way his eyes instantly assessed the tactical situation marked him as a soldier. "John Dalton," Hayes said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and vindication. "I've been looking for you for 15 years. John stood slowly, uncertainty warring with hope in his chest. The last time he'd seen Hayes, the colonel had been arguing with the military tribunal, insisting that the charges against John were fabricated. But that was before the evidence seemed overwhelming, before Morrison's lies had been accepted as truth. "Colonel," John said simply. Hayes stepped forward and extended his hand. "It's good to see you alive, John. I never believed Morrison's story about you abandoning your post." The handshake lasted longer than protocol demanded, carrying weight that words couldn't express. John felt 15 years of bitter isolation begin to crack like ice in spring sunshine. "This is Elizabeth Harmon," John said, gesturing toward the woman who had changed his life. "Her father was murdered by Vincent Kellerman for discovering a conspiracy that involves Morrison." Hayes turned his attention to Elizabeth, his expression grave. "Miss Harmon, I'm deeply sorry for your loss. Charles Harmon was a good man. I met him several times during railroad negotiations with the Army." Elizabeth produced her father's watch and the fake marshal badge, laying both items in Hayes' weathered palms. "My father died trying to expose this conspiracy, Colonel. John saved my life and helped me understand what we're really fighting." Hayes examined the evidence with the thoroughness of an experienced investigator. His face darkened as he studied the bank records hidden in the watch, and he cursed under his breath when he inspected the counterfeit badge. "This explains everything," he said finally. "For months I've been tracking irregularities in territorial law enforcement, robberies that seemed too well coordinated, evidence that mysteriously disappeared, witnesses who vanished before trials. Morrison's been using his position to protect an entire criminal network." Deputy Bradley struggled to sit up straighter. "Colonel, there's something else. The government payroll shipment scheduled for next week. Morrison and Kellerman are planning to intercept it. $200,000, Hayes confirmed grimly. Money intended to pay every federal employee and military garrison from here to California. If they succeed, it won't just be theft. It'll be an attack on federal authority in the entire territory." John retrieved his military telegraph key from his pack, the brass instrument gleaming despite years of storage. He'd salvaged it from an abandoned army post during his second year in the mountains, thinking it might prove useful someday. Now that day had arrived. "Can you reach honest federal authorities with this?" John asked, offering the telegraph key to Hayes. "If we can get to a working telegraph line that Morrison doesn't control." Hayes accepted the device with reverence. "But that means leaving these mountains and heading toward Denver, exactly where Kellerman expects Miss Harmon to run." Elizabeth stood, her dark eyes bright with determination. "Then we don't run to Denver. We bring the fight to them." Hayes studied her with growing respect. "What do you have in mind?" "The payroll shipment has to follow the main railroad route." "Through Eagle Pass," Elizabeth said, her knowledge of railroad operations proving invaluable. "That's 30 miles from here, accessible by mountain trails that Kellerman's men probably don't know. If we can reach the shipment before Morrison's people intercept it, we warn the guards and turn their ambush into a trap," John finished, understanding her strategy immediately. Hayes nodded slowly. Risky, but it could work. How many men can Kellerman field for an operation like this? At least 20, Bradley said. Maybe more if Morrison provides additional false marshals. Against what kind of guard force? Elizabeth consulted her father's notes. Standard practice for high-value shipments is 8 guards plus the train crew. Good men, but not expecting coordinated resistance from people wearing federal badges. John spread his topographical map on the tunnel floor, using lamplight to illuminate the terrain around Eagle Pass. His years of military experience and mountain knowledge combined as he traced potential approach routes and defensive positions. Here, he said, pointing to a narrow section of track that curved around a granite outcrop. Perfect spot for an ambush. The train has to slow down for the curve, and attackers could position themselves on high ground with clear fields of fire. Which means that's where Morrison will put his people, Hayes agreed. The question is how we get there first, and in sufficient force to make a difference. Elizabeth leaned over the map, her finger tracing alternative routes. What about this trail? It looks like it follows the ridgeline parallel to the railroad. Old mining trail, John confirmed. Hasn't been used in years, but it's still passable for experienced riders. More importantly, it approaches Eagle Pass from the north, the direction they won't be watching. Hayes studied the map with professional interest. Timing will be everything. The train is scheduled to reach Eagle Pass at 3 o'clock Tuesday afternoon. We'll need to be in position at least 2 hours early to set up properly. That gives us 4 days. John calculated. Time to reach Eagle Pass, scout the terrain, and prepare our own ambush. Bradley struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the tunnel wall. Colonel, I can ride. Might not be much use in a fight, but I can handle a telegraph key if we find a working line. Absolutely not, Elizabeth said firmly. You've lost too much blood. You need medical attention, not a hard ride through mountain terrain. The lady's right, Hayes agreed, but we can't leave you here either. If Reeves finds you. John had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke with the authority of a man who'd made his decision. There's a mining camp about 15 miles south of here, small settlement, but they have a doctor and a telegraph station. Tom can reach it safely while we head north toward Eagle Pass. That leaves 3 of us against 20 or more armed men, Hayes pointed out. 3 people who know this territory better than any collection of city gunmen, John replied. 3 people fighting for something that matters more than money. Elizabeth reached into her pack and pulled out a small leather journal. Her father's personal diary that she'd saved from the night of his murder. Its pages contained not just evidence of the conspiracy, but Charles Harmon's thoughts about justice, responsibility, and the price of doing what was right. My father wrote something here, she said, opening to a marked page. He said that evil succeeds when good people choose safety over action, that a person's character isn't determined by what they're willing to do when it's easy, but by what they're willing to do when it's hard. Hayes accepted the journal, reading the passage Elizabeth had indicated. Your father was a wise man, Miss Harmon, and he raised a daughter who understands what honor means. John checked his pocket watch. Still, several hours of daylight remaining, enough time to reach the mining camp with Bradley and return to meet Hayes and Elizabeth at a predetermined rendezvous point. The plan was taking shape, dangerous but achievable, with careful execution and considerable luck. Colonel, John said as they prepared to leave the mine shaft, there's something I need to know. After the tribunal, after I was branded a coward and drummed out of the service, did you ever doubt my version of what happened? Hayes met his eyes directly. Never. Not for a single day. Morrison was always too smooth, too eager to accept praise for heroics that didn't quite add up. When I heard about his civilian career in law enforcement, I suspected he'd continue his pattern of corruption. I just never had proof until now. And now we're going to finish what should have been finished 15 years ago. Hayes extended his hand again, this time not as a reunion but as a partnership. Ready to ride with me one more time, Captain? John accepted the handshake. feeling the weight of his old rank settle across his shoulders like a familiar uniform. "Ready, sir?" As they prepared to leave the mine shaft, Elizabeth slipped her mother's ring back onto her finger, not abandoning the symbol of their partnership, but reclaiming the legacy of strength and determination it represented. The time for hiding was over. The time for fighting had begun. Eagle Pass cut through the mountain like a wound, its granite walls rising 200 feet on either side of the railroad tracks. John crouched behind a boulder on the northern rim, his cavalry saber strapped to his side, the blade he'd carried through 3 Apache campaigns and hadn't touched in 15 years. The weapon felt familiar in its leather scabbard, a reminder of the officer he'd once been before Morrison's betrayal stripped away his honor. Below in the pass, Morrison's men were positioning themselves exactly where John had predicted. 12 gunmen wearing counterfeit marshal badges spread out along the eastern wall, their rifles trained on the curve where the afternoon train would have to slow. Clayton Reeves commanded from a central position, his wounded shoulder bound, but his authority intact. "Just like the old days," Colonel Hayes whispered from his position 20 yards to John's right. "Except this time we know who the real enemy is." Elizabeth lay prone behind a fallen log, her father's rifle steady in her hands. 3 days of hard riding through mountain trails had toughened her, burning away the last traces of the frightened woman who'd collapsed on John's doorstep. She'd proven herself during their approach to Eagle Pass, moving silently through terrain that would challenge experienced hunters. The plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. When the train rounded the curve and Morrison's men revealed themselves, John's team would have them caught in crossfire from superior positions. But timing would be everything. Move too early, and the gunmen would scatter. Move too late, and innocent guards on the train would die. John checked his pocket watch, 2:47 p.m. The train was due in 13 minutes, and they could already hear its whistle echoing off distant peaks. Morrison himself stood near the tracks, wearing his official deputy chief badge and carrying documents that would undoubtedly authorize his men to inspect the government payroll shipment. "There," Elizabeth whispered, pointing toward the eastern approach. Vincent Kellerman, the railroad baron, sat his horse with the confidence of a man accustomed to power, his expensive clothes and polished boots marking him as someone far removed from the violence about to unfold. He remained well back from the actual ambush position, close enough to oversee, but distant enough to claim innocence if the plan went wrong. John studied Kellerman through his field glasses, noting the man's careful positioning and obvious nervousness. Elizabeth's description hadn't prepared him for Kellerman's physical presence. Tall, well-dressed, but with the soft look of someone who'd never faced real hardship. This was a man who ordered killing from the comfort of his Denver office, not someone who pulled triggers himself. The sound of the approaching train grew louder, its steam whistle announcing the 3 p.m. schedule exactly as planned. John could see smoke rising above the trees as the locomotive climbed the grade toward Eagle Pass. In a few minutes, the engineer would throttle down for the sharp curve, and Morrison's trap would spring. "Remember," Hayes said quietly, "we want Morrison and Kellerman alive if possible. Dead men can't testify about the extent of this conspiracy." John nodded, though part of him, the part that remembered 15 years of exile and disgrace, wouldn't mind seeing Morrison face the same violence he'd dealt to others. But Hayes was right. Justice meant trials and convictions, not summary execution on a mountainside. Elizabeth shifted her position slightly, the movement drawing John's attention. She'd grown so much during their time together, transforming from victim to partner to genuine fighter. Her determination to see her father's murderers brought to justice had inspired John's own journey back from isolation to engagement. The train rounded the distant curve, its black smoke billowing against the clear mountain sky. John could make out the locomotive's details now, a powerful freight engine pulling 6 cars, the third one clearly marked as a government transport with extra guards visible on its roof and platforms. "Here they come," Hayes murmured, Below them, Morrison raised his hand, signaling his men to prepare. The counterfeit marshals checked their weapons one final time, their attention focused entirely on the approaching train. They had no idea they were being watched from above, no sense that their own trap was about to become their downfall. John drew his cavalry saber partway from its scabbard, the steel singing softly against leather. The blade bore nicks and scratches from old battles, but its edge remained sharp, maintained through all his years in the mountains as a reminder of what he'd once been. Now it would help him reclaim that identity. The train entered Eagle Pass proper, its whistle echoing off the granite walls as the engineer began slowing for the curve. Steam hissed from the locomotive's cylinders, and the screech of brakes against steel rails filled the mountain air. Morrison stepped forward, raising his badge toward the approaching train. His men emerged from cover along the eastern wall, their rifles visible but not yet threatening. To the train crew, it would look like a routine federal inspection. Exactly the deception Morrison needed to get close enough to strike. Now we find out if 15 years of exile taught me anything about patience, John whispered, his hand tightening on his rifle stock. The train rounded the curve, and Morrison's trap began to spring. The train shuddered to a complete stop as Morrison strode forward, his counterfeit badge gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Behind him, his men maintained their positions along the canyon wall, rifles ready but not yet raised. The deception was perfect. Federal marshals conducting a routine inspection of government cargo. Federal Marshal Service. Morrison called to the train crew. "We need to inspect your cargo manifest for security purposes." John watched through his rifle scope as the train's head guard, a grizzled veteran with sergeant's stripes on his sleeve, climbed down from the government car. The man's body language showed wariness, but not alarm. He had no reason to suspect the badges were fake or that the inspection was actually a robbery in progress. "Colonel Hayes," the guard called back, recognizing the name on Morrison's forged documents. "We weren't expecting an inspection here. Security protocols have changed," Morrison replied smoothly. "Recent intelligence suggests increased outlaw activity along this route. We're here to ensure the shipment reaches Denver safely." Elizabeth shifted beside her fallen log, her rifle trained on Kellerman's position. The railroad baron remained mounted well back from the action, but his nervous energy was visible even at distance. He kept checking his pocket watch and scanning the canyon walls, not for threats from above, but for signs that his plan was proceeding smoothly. The moment came when Morrison's men began moving toward the train cars. What had appeared to be protective positioning suddenly revealed itself as tactical deployment for robbery. But the transformation was so subtle that the train guards didn't immediately recognize the threat. John heard Hayes take a deep breath, preparing to spring their counter-trap. But before the colonel could give the signal, everything went wrong. One of Morrison's men, impatient or nervous, raised his rifle too soon, pointing it directly at a train guard. The veteran sergeant's military instincts kicked in, and he dove for cover while shouting a warning to his men. "It's a trap. They're not real marshals." Gunfire erupted across Eagle Pass as the train guards realized they were under attack. Morrison cursed and drew his sidearm, the careful deception collapsing into open violence. His men opened fire on the train, their shots sparking off steel cars and shattering windows. "Now," Hayes shouted. John's rifle barked, its bullet taking down one of Morrison's gunmen before the man could reload. Elizabeth's shot came a heartbeat later, wounding another attacker and sending him sprawling behind inadequate cover. Hayes's military precision showed as he systematically began picking off targets from his elevated position. The crossfire from above caught Morrison's men completely by surprise. They'd prepared for resistance from the train guards, but had no idea they were exposed to marksmen on the canyon rim. Men who'd been confident attackers suddenly found themselves trapped between two forces. Clayton Reeves screamed orders, trying to rally his scattered men while returning fire toward the canyon rim. But the angles were all wrong. John's team held the high ground with clear fields of fire, while Morrison's people were pinned in an exposed position with limited cover. John worked his rifle with mechanical precision, each shot placed with the skill of a man who'd learned marksmanship in Apache country, where missing meant dying. His cavalry training had returned as if the 15 years of exile had never happened, muscle memory guiding his movements while his mind calculated ranges and wind drift. But the real revelation was Elizabeth. She fired with steady determination, her shots finding their marks with surprising accuracy. When one of Morrison's men tried to flank their position, she pivoted smoothly and put 2 rounds center mass, dropping him before he could threaten their flank. The battle turned when Morrison realized his position was hopeless. Instead of continuing a futile fight, he broke cover and ran toward Kellerman's position, shouting for retreat. Several of his surviving men followed, abandoning their wounded comrades in favor of escape. John drew his cavalry saber and started down the canyon wall, pursuing Morrison with 15 years of accumulated rage driving his legs. The blade felt alive in his hand, eager to taste the blood of the man who destroyed his honor and betrayed his trust. "Morrison!" John's voice echoed off the granite walls like a battle cry. The corrupt deputy chief turned, his face going white as he recognized his former subordinate. The man he'd betrayed, the officer he'd branded a coward, was bearing down on him with naked steel gleaming in the mountain sunlight. Morrison fumbled for his revolver, but John was already too close. The saber swept up in a silver arc, knocking the gun from Morrison's hand and opening a long cut across his gun arm. Morrison stumbled backward, terror replacing arrogance in his pale eyes. "Please," Morrison gasped, blood running down his sleeve. "John, please. I can explain everything." John raised the saber for a killing stroke, 15 years of bitter exile and ruined honor demanding payment in blood. But as the blade reached its apex, he caught sight of Elizabeth watching from above, her dark eyes reflecting not bloodlust, but hope for justice rather than vengeance. The saber stopped, trembling in John's grip as he fought between rage and righteousness. 3 months later, John stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, watching Elizabeth arrange wildflowers in a mason jar on their new kitchen table. The morning sun streamed through windows that no longer bore the scars of gunfire, illuminating a home that had been transformed from a hermit's retreat into something warmer, more welcoming. The new cabin door, constructed with Elizabeth's help from fresh pine logs, stood open to the mountain air. Its threshold no longer a barrier against the world, but an invitation to it. Colonel Hayes was expected for dinner that evening, the first of what had become regular visits from the outside world that John had once fled. "The Denver newspapers arrived this morning," Elizabeth said, holding up a bundle of papers tied with string. Morrison's trial made the front page again. John accepted the papers with interest that still surprised him. 3 months ago, he wouldn't have cared about news from anywhere beyond his mountain sanctuary. Now he found himself eager for reports on the conspiracy trials that had grown from Elizabeth's evidence and their confrontation at Eagle Pass. The headlines told a satisfying story. Morrison had been convicted of treason, corruption, and conspiracy to commit robbery against the United States government. His sentence, 20 years in federal prison, seemed appropriate for a man who'd betrayed his oath and sold out honest lawmen for personal gain. Vincent Kellerman faced similar charges, his railroad empire crumbling as investigators uncovered the full extent of his criminal activities. "Listen to this," Elizabeth said, reading from the lead article. "The heroic actions of former Captain John Dalton, Colonel William Hayes, and Miss Elizabeth Harmon have exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of territorial government. Their courage in facing overwhelming odds serves as a reminder that individual citizens can make a difference when they choose justice over personal safety." John smiled, though the praise still felt strange after years of disgrace. More important than newspaper acclaim was the official letter from the War Department that had arrived 2 weeks ago, a formal apology for the military tribunal's decision, along with restoration of his rank and full military honors. The letter had offered him a position as a federal marshal, which he was seriously considering. Elizabeth set down the newspaper and moved to the kitchen area, where she'd been preparing their evening meal. She wore a simple dress of blue cotton, her dark hair pinned back in a practical style that suited their mountain life. The wedding band on her finger, her mother's ring that John had returned to her after their engagement, caught the morning light as she worked. "Any regrets about staying here instead of returning to Denver?" John asked, joining her at the stove. "None," Elizabeth replied without hesitation. "I spent 25 years in cities surrounded by people I couldn't trust. I'd rather spend the rest of my life on this mountain with one person I can trust completely." The transformation in their relationship had been gradual but profound. What had begun as protection had evolved into partnership, then into something deeper that neither had expected to find. John had rediscovered his capacity for love, while Elizabeth had found the strength to build a new life from the ashes of tragedy. A knock at their open door interrupted their conversation. Colonel Hayes stood on the threshold, his uniform replaced by civilian clothes, but his bearing still unmistakably military. In his hands, he carried a leather satchel and what appeared to be an official document. "Colonel," John said, extending his hand in greeting. "You're early. I wanted to speak with both of you before dinner," Hayes replied, accepting the handshake warmly. "I have news from Washington." They gathered around the kitchen table, the same rough-hewn surface where John had once planned his defense against Morrison's fake marshals, now serving as the center of a shared domestic life. Hayes opened his satchel and withdrew several official-looking papers. "The Treasury Department has authorized a reward for your role in preventing the payroll robbery," Hayes said, placing a bank draft on the table. $50,000 to be split between the two of you." Elizabeth stared at the amount written on the draft. "That's more money than Father left me after settling his debts." "It's also recognition that your actions saved the federal government far more than the original payroll amount," Hayes continued. "But there's something else. The president has asked me to offer you both positions in a new federal investigative service. The conspiracy you exposed has shown the need for honest lawmen who can operate independently of local corruption." John considered the offer seriously. The work would be dangerous but meaningful, exactly the kind of purpose he'd been missing during his years of isolation. More importantly, it would allow him and Elizabeth to continue working together while serving something larger than themselves. "What do you think?" he asked Elizabeth. "I think my father would be proud to know his death led to something good," she replied. "And I think we make a good team," Hayes smiled, clearly pleased by their response. "There's no rush to decide. Take whatever time you need." As evening approached and they prepared dinner together, John reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a broken hermit, convinced that trust was impossible, and love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Elizabeth's arrival had shattered that carefully constructed isolation, forcing him to remember who he'd once been and discover who he might become. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the cabin's approach trail. But instead of feeling the old tension that visitors had once triggered, John found himself looking forward to seeing who might be joining them for dinner. Their door was open to the world again, and the world no longer seemed like something to fear. Elizabeth took his hand as they stood together on their porch, watching the sun set behind the mountain peaks that had witnessed their transformation. Two broken souls had found healing in each other's company, discovering that sometimes the greatest courage comes not from standing alone, but from choosing to stand together.